Would you design your home as a corridor, the fastest way to get from the front door to the back door? No. Then why have we done this to our cities? We need to design our public space not as a corridor, but as a living room. We want to live in a living city. Welcome to the Living City Ville Salon podcast. My name is Elke van den Brand. I'm the Brussels Minister for Mobility, Public Works and Road Security. And we are facing a climate emergency. We need to find a way to both tackle the climate crisis and deliver social justice. And I'm changing Brussels because I believe that changing our mobility choices is a powerful lever for a just transition. But I'm just one person. A just transition must be created by the many, not by the few. And in this podcast series, I will be talking to many people who have plenty of ideas and experiences. People from Brussels or from abroad, people who inspire the way cities are changing and how citizens are leading the way. The episodes will be in either English, French or Dutch. And you can sit on your sofa, put your feet on the coffee table and be inspired. Got a question, an idea, an answer? Join the debate and contact me via Instagram, Facebook or email. Today I'm very happy to welcome Melissa Brunet. Melissa is a Canadian author and urban mobility advocate. Along with her husband Chris, she forms a productive tandem, almost literally. They live with their family. They live their family life and their professional life on a bicycle. In 2019, they moved to Delft in the Netherlands, quite a contrast to Vancouver, where they used to live before. Together, Chris and Melissa wrote two books, Cycling City, the Dutch Blueprint for Urban Mobility, and Curbing Traffic, the human case for fewer cars in our city. Both are very popular publications among urban activists and mobility experts. Melissa Brunet is also a Women Mobilize Women ambassador to create more gender equity in mobility, and I'm very honored to get the chance to talk to Melissa. Hi, Melissa. Welcome.
Hi, Elke. It's an honor for me to be here as well.
So my first question, you moved around. So you moved from Vancouver to Delft. Perhaps tell us why.
Yeah, so in 2000, well, let's go way back. In 2007, we actually moved from Ontario, not too far from Toronto, to Vancouver at a time when they were electing a very progressive mayor who ran on a platform of building out cycling infrastructure. And through a series of events, not the least of which was both my husband and I working in Vancouver and no longer needing to use a car to get around, we sold our family car and started getting around predominantly on bicycle, foot, or public transport. And that just sort of launched us into becoming cycling advocates. And for myself, using my perspective as a mom of two young children at the time, answering the constant questions of how do you exist as a mom with no car, getting around by bike. It's got to be impossible. And I felt compelled to share my stories, felt compelled to be part of the cycling advocacy that was shifting the conversation. And yeah, that just sort of grew and snowballed to becoming a consultancy that Chris and I started to share content, writing video films, promoting what cycling can do. And it feels that there's this inevitable point in every cycling advocate's lives where if you're going to talk about cycling advocacy, you're going to talk about how great it can make cities. You have to go to the Netherlands and you have to experience it. So in 2016, we took 5 weeks to travel across 5 different cities in the Netherlands, experiencing everything that had been established, learning why the Netherlands became such a cycling nation, and essentially fell in love with it. The story we like to tell people is that when we told the kids it was time to go home, they cried, which on one hand was very sad because it was probably end of vacation, now we have to go home, all those fun things, but also for them, it was the first opportunity for them to experience being more autonomous. We allowed them to go to the neighborhood playground near where we were staying without us watching them all the time. We felt so much more comfortable. And I think from that point on, and in the development of building the cycling city and the research we were doing, we realized, this is where we belong. This is where our kids were happiest. This is where we would be happiest. And so we took that opportunity with all the connections we made to basically see if we could find work. It was, again, another 3 years before we could make that a reality. But yeah, it was really just this opportunity to allow our kids, even though they were teenagers by the time we moved, to have that freedom of movement, that autonomy for them, and for us to experience that quality of life that we were really striving for in Vancouver, and we hope that one day they achieve. But for us, we were ready to sort of become a part of the story on this side of the Atlantic, and then now get to work promoting that around the world. So it's been, it was not an easy move. People say, oh, it looked like it was so easy. It was not. Learning Dutch is not easy. We're still working on it after almost 5 years. But yeah, just watching our children get to thrive in this change, and being able to, yeah, just enjoy life walking and cycling without having to stress about what's happening around us has been, yeah, amazing. And I don't think we'd trade it for any.
Never regretted it?
No regrets. No, I think we missed family, of course. Yeah. But we were so far away from them, living on the west coast of Canada. You know, we were still 5,000 kilometers away from them there.
So different country, same distance.
Exactly. So it's just now they get to come to Europe and visit all sorts of great places like Brussels. So it works out for both of us. We get to live where we want to, and they get to travel Europe when they come.
But we cannot have everybody live to Delft.
No.
So perhaps we need to change the rest of the world to become a bit more Delft. This is a podcast series about the living room and creating our public space like a living room. What is your living city like? How do you think a city should look like? What it should be?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Not every city can be Delft or Utrecht or any other Dutch city. But what we need to be doing, and what I try to do, at least in what I communicate, is remind people that our public spaces are spaces where we're meant to gather. Historically, 100, 200 years ago, they were where we would come together, where we would socialize, meet up with friends, make new connections in our cities. And we lost that over the last 100 years as cars became more and more dominant. And so I really think that a living city is where we start to shift that back. And we see that in cities like Brussels, like in Paris, like Barcelona and Montreal in Canada, where there's this reclamation of space back for people. And that's how we can create that living city, that opportunity to be social, to meet up with friends, and have even that intergenerational connection that is so important, that we can pass on knowledge from generation to generation, and meet people outside of our bubbles to make us, I think, just better people altogether.
And you see good examples, because you said, well, I was fighting in Vancouver and I went to Delft. It's a bit like, okay, it's always a fight, it's a struggle all around the world to get cities to move on. Do you see good examples of how this shift has been made, and where we can get our inspiration and make a show that it's possible? Because we often hear also in Belgium, it's the Netherlands. It comes in the water, but actually it is also a political choice. In the Netherlands, we have political choices being made a few decades ago, making this shift and not having car-oriented cities. But now it's like this idea, this is not possible anywhere else, although I hope you agree with me that it is possible. And we need to make the same choices. But where do you see these? Do you have good examples of cities that you visit where the shift is popping up and inspiring you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think every city I travel to, I get to find these little pockets, and I like to be surprised, because there is this assumption that only in the Netherlands are cities like living rooms. They're not perfect by any stretch. They still have some work to do as well. But I think everywhere I go, there's always like these little aha moments. One in particular this year that I was very privileged to experience was I was invited to travel to Bogota, and I had never been to Latin America. And I'd heard a lot about what was happening there, about what Mayor Lopez and her team were doing there. But I didn't fully know what that looked like on the ground. And we had a break at one point. It was a very busy schedule. And we went into the old center, and they had traffic calmed so many of their streets and pedestrianized them. And you saw children playing, you saw seniors enjoying an afternoon coffee, you saw teenagers and young adults all interacting in these public spaces that would have been parking lots. And for me, I feel like why that was so important, and even though I've seen similar scenes elsewhere in the world, or elsewhere in Europe and North America anyway, for me, it was sort of this proof that this is not just a European idea. This is not just a North American idea. These are things that can be done in any city. And it takes a little bit of bravery from politicians and the people doing the work, but also a recognition that, you know, these are the spaces that we really value. And so regardless of if your culture is one that likes to have a siesta and then, you know, get together in the afternoon for an afternoon coffee, or one where it's busy and bustling, but on the weekends you take that time to spend together. You know, it is, regardless of your geographic location, we can do this, and it's so important for the city to do it.
You've talked a lot about children, your own children being autonomous, like being one of the main reasons to move to cross the ocean. Now you're seeing children playing in the streets. Are children are these a new scale we need to build our cities on?
Absolutely, yeah. So often when I'm having conversations around mobility and public space, we're talking about people our age, or people between the ages of like 25 to 60, let's say, who are getting to work, or they're going out and enjoying dinner as adults. That's who we're focused on. But there's this whole group of people that we all once were that don't have that freedom because they need to be driven around by their parents or under constant chaperoning. And if we flip our thinking to think more about children, really think about their experience of the city, we can start to create more inclusive spaces, because children are more vulnerable. They do take risks in a different way that adults do. They need to learn all of that. But if we don't give them the space to do it, then they never get to learn, and they're constantly dependent on us as their parents to show them the way, which, you know, is part of our job as parents, but at some point we need to let go, and we need to know that when we do that, that they'll still be safe. Yeah.
I think that's one of the fears many parents have in a city like Brussels and everywhere. It's like, will my child build this safe? So we take them around. But for me, it's even also a matter of the right of children. So many people in cities, they live in small spaces, and we seem to have given up public space as a possible playground for our children. I remember when I was young, I went far away. I went to 2-3 kilometers. That was quite a large distance, but I see my children, they say closer home, and, and we feel that we've taken away space from our children, and they use public space just as temporary moments to get through, but not as a place to go to. And that's something that I'm surprised of in a city as Brussels. But
yeah, and I think it's so fascinating, because at the same time that we feel the need to protect children as adults, to make sure that we bring them around in cars predominantly because that's the safest way to move them, we also at the same time are saying kids need to get outside more. They need to not be in front of screens. They need to be socializing. But they can't do it if we don't give them the space to do it. So it's this weird dichotomy that we find ourselves in, and part of, that's one of the arguments I make, is if you want all of this, then we need to change this, because if it's not safe enough for them to walk out their front door and cross the street, then there's no reason that any parent is going to push their child off a screen to go outside if they're going to worry they're going to be injured or worse the moment they step outside.
And can you get around without a car with 2 young children in a city? You did the change.
I did it.
So the answer might be yes to this question.
Yeah, and well, it's part activism on my side. I was determined to show that it was possible, and part the responsibility of people planning our cities to create that safe space, because that was the only reason I could do it. I had neighborhood bikeways that I could use we had a bike trailer that we would use, or cycling with them when they were independent enough. We had lots of bike lanes getting built in the city, and it was only with all that cycling infrastructure that it was possible. And so my role was to show all of this so that other people would do it too. It's not always easy. You can't solve every trip, and that's a really important thing. It's not about every trip being a cycle trip, but it being a choice. So I was able to cycle when it was possible, and if it was not possible, mixing cycling with public transport, or just taking public transport and walking, but having that choice, because it was possible. Car share helped if we had to go really far. But I don't feel that our quality of experience was diminished because we were getting around by bike or by public transport.
You said infrastructure, it's the key to making it possible. I'm a politician, but Is that the main focus we need to take, or do we also need to take time to sensibilize, to advocate? It's where do we start to change? What is the...
Yeah, the chicken and egg question. I mean, I think infrastructure is key to creating the safer space, but it has to happen in tandem with education and communication and advocacy. If the two are not happening at the same time, then it'll always be a struggle. And that's why I got started in this space. Was our city was investing in all of this cycling infrastructure. We had a very brave mayor and council, some councillors, not all, that were pushing for all of this. But the communications part was missing from the story. And so that's where I felt that my voice and my talents could be used, is to provide that communication and that advocacy. And we see in cities where you can combine the two, that work to build out the infrastructure, to make the plans, to do all the hard stuff, when it happens in tandem with good communications and making sure that you're not leaving this void that can be filled with negative voices, you see more success. It's not always 100% perfect, as you know yourself.
Some negative.
Yeah. But, I think we can't underestimate the value of good communications and just finding the right message for the people that you're communicating with. And
is there one right message, or do we need to have, because it's debate we have in Brussels as well, how to communicate, how to dialogue with the population. That's always a challenge as a government. So we had huge discussions and learning processes about that. But it's easier said than done, I think. Just communicate, okay, but to whom, how, through which channel? These are questions that are asked. So do you have good examples on that, or good tips on that?
Well, exactly what you said, understanding who are you communicating with, and so with that group, how do you best communicate with them? What mediums do you use? And I think it's always a multi-pronged effort. A really good example, I think, that we talked about in our first book was in the city of Calgary, when they developed their pilot downtown cycling network. They, at the same time that it was released, sent out ambassadors to be at junctions to talk to pedestrians and drivers and cyclists. This is how you need to behave, putting out pamphlets and information. So everyone sort of understood, having a live data map on their website so people could see the actual counts of people cycling. Because when you look at a bike lane, one bike, it always seems empty. One bike is one bike. And so you're like, oh, it was used by one person today, but that was one person in the moment. So it's a multi-pronged effort, and I think for them it worked out quite well, because that 18-month pilot became permanent, and was almost voted down, and then unanimously voted in when it was to be made permanent. So, understanding who, understanding how, where, and knowing that one group is going to take a message much differently than another, and so being able to tailor your messages is also super important.
A lot of your, if you talk about communication, look at your communication, you're often quite explicit about being against cars, which is something that in Brussels, you're anti-cars. No, I'm pro-bike, I'm pro-human, I'm pro-life in a city, so you can't be against cars, but you seem to be saying, let's talk about cars.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm anti-car. I think they have their place. I've been forced to not have a car for the last 5 years for various licensing reasons in the Netherlands. But I think we've defaulted for so long that the car is the only option, where we need to really be thinking about how can we make other options for people. And I think the really big challenge is that, and the question I get is, well, what do you do in a place like where our parents live, which is suburban Ontario in Canada? What do you tell those people? And my response is, well, they don't have a choice. My parents don't have a choice but to get in a car to get around. In about 10, 15 years, they might not have a choice to not be able to drive, because they'll be aged out of being able to do so safely. But unless you give them another choice, it makes sense that you've got traffic in your city. And so it's more like talking about the choices. It comes off as anti-car because I don't use a car. But, there's a time and a place, but it's all about the choice, I think.
Offering alternatives to people.
Yeah.
You moved to Delft because you got there what you wanted. And that's a personal question, but were you tired of fighting? And was it a relief to stop fighting for a moment?
A little bit, yeah. Yeah, I think it wasn't quite 10 years that we were doing advocacy work in Vancouver, but it's hard to continually, advocate for something, know that it's the right way to go, and hear the voices saying, yeah, well, we can't do this. We're not the Netherlands. This is Vancouver. We have hills. We have winter. All these. We have lots of rain. All of these.
Sounds like Brussels. Yeah. Hills, rain. Yeah. Not the Netherlands. We check those boxes.
Yeah, exactly. And so moving was, this great opportunity to just like shut off for a little bit. But I think you never shut off. Once you see this side of things, once you see what cities can be, once you know the ingredients, it's hard to turn off. And so now it's not so much that I've stopped fighting, but I've just shifted, and I can, from the comfort of my Dutch home, I can now travel to other places and talk to people and share with them why it's important to make these shifts. One thing that I think has been helpful in making this move is I've also been able to see mobility even more through an equity and inclusion lens of what can be done in that space.
That's something that you had from the Netherlands? That's something?
Just something in that move, because I wasn't as focused on building out cycling lanes anymore. It wasn't just about making things better for biking. It was about all of the people that I was seeing in that move that are benefiting from cycling, of people on adapted cycles, people in wheelchairs and mobility scooters, like children, women, the elderly, people of migration backgrounds that, people seem to think are left out of the conversation, and I was seeing them being included. All of that, I think, kind of shifted my thinking to being, okay, it's not just about bikes, it's about who gets to benefit when we make cars less dominant and we give people choice. Yeah.
So, car-dominant city is less inclusive than other cities?
Absolutely, 100%.
And does it go, we talked about children, you're a woman, is it, you talked about elderly people, is it also in the social interaction? Do we really become more inclusive, or do we see more people in the street because it becomes very visual when we don't hide in a car? Is it because we notice other people and so we become more aware, or is there really more interaction also between the people?
Yeah, I think what it is when we stop moving around so much in a car, when we're in our own little space, our protected space, we, like you said, you see people, but it's not just that you see people like through a windshield, but you actually see them face to face on a much more human scale way of moving. And I think what happens in those spaces where you've provided more space for walking, more space for cycling, more space, like more frequent and reliable public transportation, you inherently see people that don't look like you, that don't come from the same backgrounds as you. And that builds an empathy in a different way than when we're all moving around behind a windshield. So yeah, I think, you're creating a more social space just by creating a more social way of moving around.
Do you have more interaction in your neighborhood in Delft than you had in Vancouver?
Yes. Yeah.
And it is because of mobility?
I think
or is it because you looked for new contacts, because you're away from your family, and because...
That's a great question, yeah. It was, because my street was quieter, because I could step out my front door and, my neighbors would be outside having a chat. I started to know people in my community a lot better than I did in Vancouver. We did have the benefit in Vancouver of living in a cooperative housing development, so it was already a community. But once you stepped outside those doors, I didn't know who lived in the house or apartment building next door unless their kid went to my kid's school. Otherwise, I didn't know anybody. Whereas, because of a series of events, not the least of which was me locking myself out of the house.
We've all been there.
Yeah. I was forced to meet my neighbors because they were there, and I could knock on someone's door and it was much more comfortable. We could troubleshoot on the street without cars whizzing by. We've moved since then and got to know, we have a young woman living on one side of the house who also has a cat, so we share cat stories. And then on the other side is an older couple who doesn't speak any English, and so this forced us to speak Dutch and get to know them. And all of this wouldn't happen if we didn't have a quieter space where we were living. So yeah, it's because of mobility, but that mobility inherently has created this living space just outside our front door.
We had the same impact. We had this holiday projects in Brussels, which was during COVID because people couldn't leave the country and we couldn't have mass events. So we did some kind of pop-up local project that people could propose. And so it was a street opened up for children playing and closed down for traffic, or a roundabout where we put a lot of sand and it became a little beach. So we had a lot of those projects. And it was meant as a way to comfort during COVID and to have an idea about how to use public space. But that was one of the things that came out is I met my neighbors. The importance of that little sense, I met my neighbors and I found somebody to babysit or to do my groceries, and I feel more safe and welcome in especially women and elderly people in public space. So it's something I recognize, but it's difficult in now how do we translate this in a permanent way and what to do first. If you would be in my position, what's the first step to do to get there? Because you can dream of something, but how do you make it happen? Make the dream a reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the beautiful things that you just said, like during COVID, was there's all these pilot projects happening around the world because we had to. We didn't have a choice. We had to just trial a bunch of things. We had to do it in a very short amount of time. And it proved that these things could work and that they would benefit. And so I think a lot of times in my work, or people I'm having conversations with, is like, do those pilot projects, test out ideas. Because if they don't work, they're not permanent. We can change them, we can adjust them, but they become the catalyst for change. So they were the catalyst for cycle lanes in Berlin, although I know there's some questions around that now. They became the catalyst for change in Paris. You know, even here, you know, people knowing their neighbors, once you lose that, you're like, whoa, hold on a second. I really like that and I want that to be permanent. And so you see the shift. And that's what I think, pilot projects or, you know, demonstration projects, tactical urbanism, whatever you want to call it, are these great opportunities to test ideas and show people. As a politician, you can say it's not permanent. If you don't like it, that's fine. Most people tend to like it.
Well, most of the time, yes. I have to say, sometimes people are saying because you're not using the same quality. And so, for example, in Barcelona with the superblocks, they had some of them who were really rearranged with trees and little squares, and that has become attractive. But if they had the same also with permanent infrastructure, it takes a lot of more maintenance and to make it beautiful and easily degrade. So it is also always a challenge in offering high quality also. And I noticed that testing too much can also have a certain backlash.
Well, there has to be this like conversation around, okay, we're testing out all these ideas and this has all worked, and then but where is the budget to make it concrete, to make it permanent? Because paint on a street looks beautiful for a time and then weather kicks in, and so what do we do in those situations? So
we've talked about inclusive politics and is it also necessary, inclusive cities, is it also necessary that politics become more inclusive? Do you see a difference in, because you're advocating for women, mobilize women, so do you see a difference in when women step in or minority groups step in? Does it matter?
Oh, absolutely, so one of the things that we learned when we were putting together Curbing Traffic, and I think we always inherently knew, but we bring our personal experiences to what we do. And so the reason our cities were designed in a way that seems much more patriarchal, much more male-focused, is because men were designing our cities when planning first became a thing. Because they were designing to get to work, for all the functions of their daily life, because they were planning for what they knew. And women were kind of kept out of that because we were at home or it's just not as prominent. And what you see is in cities where you're starting to see, not necessarily gender parity, because not every city can reach that just yet, but you see more women entering the planning field as engineers, as entering into politics, you see a shift because we're bringing our perspectives with us. We're bringing our perspectives as women, as moms, as carers. You know, we experience the city differently. Social safety is a different experience for women, so we bring that into the conversations. And the same goes for people that are coming from migration backgrounds, people with disabilities, even older citizens or young citizens. We all have a different experience, and so the more diverse our politicians can be, the more diverse our city planning teams and engineers can be, those people that are making the changes in our cities, the more inclusive the space can become. Because we're all, we're designing for what we understand the city to be, and each of us has a value, whether that's male, female, or otherwise, to making that city more inclusive.
And why focusing on women and mobility, this interaction? What is there? What trickled you in that?
Well, because I'm a woman in mobility, I think.
But I think there's more to it than that.
I think, well, because I pull from my experiences, and I do see, wow, okay, if we're going way back, I was told at one point in a conversation around planning for a podcast that there just aren't a lot of women that have ever done this. And so, you know, this is, there, you'll just interview men because there aren't a lot of women out there. And I'm like, well, that's, pardon my French, that's bullshit.
That's English, not French.
Yes, I know, sorry. But so I sought out to actually find those women that were doing the work. And I think for me, that's the natural connection between the fact that I work in mobility advocacy, and it just seemed like a natural thing to like, okay, where are the women in transport? Where is women in mobility? And how can we further this conversation?
And where are they?
They're everywhere. We're hiding everywhere. Some of us in plain sight, some of us a little bit under the radar. And so what I hope to do, and what I strive to do, is to bring light to those women that are working in the field, and in all aspects where I can, not just those that are leaders, but also women that are doing the hard work behind the scenes as well. Just to remind people that that we're there, and that, you know, we're all doing important work. It's not to diminish the work of our male colleagues, but, you know, the more we shine a light on women and non-binary people that fit into this space, the more we can understand that it's not just, there are women doing the work, and they're there, and we need to listen to them as well.
You did all these interviews, you met people. Did your perspective change before? Did you have a certain hypothesis that said, okay, you said, I want to put a line on them, but you did have expectations, and did they change during the process? Did you learn certain aspects that were new for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned Women Mobilize Women, and that I've been able to be an ambassador for them. That experience, for me, I know I was brought on to provide a bit of a face for them and do a lot of writing and communications for them. But through that experience, I've had the privilege of meeting women from around the world who challenge the way I think. Mm-hmm. In a good way, not in a bad way. But for example, about a year and a half, 2 years ago almost, I wrote a piece around feminist cities and the link with 15-minute cities. Mm-hmm. And I spoke with a woman named Kalpana Viswanath from Delhi. And she said, well, that's a really great idea, but it doesn't work in Delhi. Mm-hmm. Because we can't have a 15-minute city, because we're a city of 32 million people. And so through that conversation, we could have a dialogue, and she could shift my thinking to being, it's not just about the city, it's more about thinking maybe about neighborhoods in that context, and how do we translate these ideas to emerging economies that have different city makeups, and have different populations and different disparities that we need to be thinking about. And that for me has been hugely valuable to sort of challenge my own thinking as someone who's lived in Europe and North America predominantly, spent most of my time in these places. You know, how can I think differently? How can I challenge my own thinking to be aware that it's my existence and my experience might be smaller than somebody else's, not smaller, but limited compared to somebody else's. And so how can I bring those perspectives into what I do? Is it a female thing to be, because it's putting yourself in a vulnerable position, not claiming to have the truth and being open to learn from others, and you say you like to be challenged on what you're saying. Is that mm-hmm. something that it's more women characteristic as an aspect, or is it the cultural element, or is it just you? Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's just me. Yeah. And I do think that I know a lot of men that also are more open. Yeah, I think inherently as women we have to be more empathetic. It's just in our roles, mm-hmm. even though they're more traditional, sort of in that thinking of like the more binary, gender binary approach, that we need to be thinking about our parents, we need to be thinking about our children, thinking about our friends. There's more empathy built into how we're supposed to experience mm-hmm. the city. And so that might make us more open to these things. But I don't think it's inherently just women. I think that men have the capacity
I'm certain about that, yes.
to make these
And not all women have this capacity
no,
either.
Exactly,
So it's,
exactly, yeah. But I think there's just this empathy that's built into how a lot of us experience cities, and so it changes, or it just experience life, and so maybe keeps us a little more open.
And if you single out the politicians, because as a politician, I'm a female politician, I think doubt is something important. As a politician, you need to doubt, you need to learn, you need to challenge yourself. But on the other hand, it is often considered as a weakness. Like you need to know what you want, you need to know what you go for, you need to defend your struggles. And if you show doubt, or if you acknowledge that you perhaps made a mistake, it is often seen as a weakness. Have you seen women using it as a strength, or men using it as a strength to dare to challenge themselves while in office?
While in office?
Because afterwards it's more common. But
yeah. I mean, I think I've probably seen lots of cases of it, maybe not been as aware of it as maybe I am now. Certainly, I think of, Jacinda Ardern, understanding, maybe I have some doubt, or maybe it's time for me to think about things differently, and being okay with that. I see, even, it wasn't when he was elected, but the mayor of Vancouver, he was this like activist cyclist, dead set on, we don't need to build out cycle lanes. You just have to be brave enough to do it, and understanding and making that shift, like, no, okay, maybe I'm wrong. Yeah. And maybe I need to change my thinking. So I do think we all have the capacity to do that. And I see it actually as a strength, and maybe that's my own political leanings. But if a politician is like, okay, I was wrong, and this is how I think I've heard what people have said and I want to shift, I see that as a strength. I don't know that everyone does. But yeah, I think people have the capacity and have done that to a success for a lot of people, yeah.
So I agree that you need to be able to do something. Really important aspect to hold on as a politician, to dare to challenge yourself. On the same time, it's bringing change in mobility and in public space. It is often going against the current, and so you need to explain, defend. So you also become in this, you need to explain why, you need to put a lot in convincing in place to say this is why we need to do it, this is what's possible. And so it is a bit contradictory sometimes in going all the way and convincing people and trying to get people abroad of change. And so that's
well, there's this political bravery that's a part of it as well, right? And I think, you've experienced this yourself. There's this, I have to stick with what I hold to be true and what I know is good, even if people are against it. And oftentimes that fortitude, that willingness to stick to your ethics and your morals, to push this through, can be a success. And I've seen it be a success in lots of cities. I think what's important, though, is still within that determination to have the capacity to be open to how maybe this idea as a whole is exactly what we need, but maybe our approach needs to shift. And maybe it's more just being open to those kinds of things. It doesn't change the goal, just changes the approach. Yeah.
Now we're talking about politics, and you're advocating for, saying women, but in general more diversity in politics, to open our perspectives, because it will give a better outcome. How can we convince young people to go for it, to step into politics, to be leaders of change?
Yeah, that's a big one.
Somebody needs to tell the answer. But
I don't know that I have specifically the answer, but I think one of the things that we try to do is through the talks that we're able to do, through the presentations, is just remind people that, especially young people, that it's often when they have these great ideas and they have the strength and community and willingness to step forward, that they can be quite successful. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be difficult, but I mean, the next generation of city planners and politicians and advocates are needed. We have to, and so our job now at, middle age, I guess, is where we find ourselves, is to give them everything they need and that support to lift up their voices so that they can take up those reins, and support them when they get there, because we know it's not easy. We know that there will be pushback and, you know, struggles. But if we can say, yeah, we know this is hard, but we're here for you, and we think you can do it, and it's important that you do it, then I think, you know, it'll help. It's not going to make me get everyone on board, but yeah.
In your personal perspective, so you certain time you realized, hey, I'm becoming an advocate, I'm becoming a cyclist advocate, a mobility advocate. What were the triggers in your life, to moments where you noticed these were changing moments or changing things that happened that made you go for it, or that gave you energy also and continue to go for it?
I think it's interesting. I think throughout your life, there's all these little moments that like compile together. And when you think back, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. For example, Chris will often joke, like, did you ever think that we would end up in Europe? And I'll be like, yeah, no, on our honeymoon, we were in Bilbao walking on the water, and it was calm and everyone was outside and it was beautiful. I'm like, this is where we need to be. Okay. And then, now I have to do the math. 14 years later, we were in Europe. And so there's these like little moments where you realize, but in that moment, I knew I wanted to live in Europe, but I didn't understand that it was because I wanted to be in a social place, in a place where people are outside and being around each other. And now I'm advocating for that. So there's all these little like moments, even just, you know, I grew up in a one-car household, so I was getting around by public transport and walking and cycling. Didn't think anything of it at the time, but now if I think back, it's like, no, that was all steps in this way of knowing that it is possible to move around a city differently and to see your city differently. Yeah, so I think it's all of that compiled together. But the big thing for me was, living in a city like Vancouver at the time and getting around with our kids and having the stupidest conversations with them while we were on bicycle, like our son asking about space. I'm by no means an astronomer, anyway, but someone that, someone that studies space. But having these like in-depth conversations that would not have been possible in any other scenario. And so all these moments sort of compiled together, just, these are things that I want to pass on to other people. And so I think that's sort of how I got into, and how I stay in this space as well.
So it's always about connecting to people. That's something that comes back, having contact. And if you go a bit back to what does it mean for public space and mobility, and how we get to organize it. And you've traveled around, you've talked about Delhi, how message was, well, this recipe doesn't work here. Are there basic recipes that work everywhere? Is it something to say, okay, just put in place cycling lanes and people will start cycling? Are there certain things that don't work everywhere? So can you have the mandatory menu and the optional menu to change a city, or is it more complex than that?
I think it's complex for every city, but the basics comes back to exactly that. It's connection. And all the cities that are moving towards building out cycling lanes, building out better public spaces, creating pedestrianized areas, are all focused on connection and returning that human connection to how we experience our cities. How we do that differs. Regardless, it doesn't. Wherever we are in the world, everything is slightly different, but it's all about finding that inspiration and then applying it in context to where we live. So the solution that has worked in the Netherlands is not exactly the solution that will work in Brussels or in Delhi or in Bogota or in Montreal, but we can all learn from each other. And as long as the core of that is to create a much more connected community where, regardless of your age, your gender, your ability, your background, you can be a part of that, then, you know.
Does it mean that in urban planning and public works we need to put in more sociologists, anthropologists? For example, I'm responsible for public works, so we are reorganizing squares and streets, and so we have some very good engineers working on a plan and saying where we need to put the cyclists and the pedestrians and how to do it. Do we need to put in place social workers also to think about public space? Is that a conclusion of what you're saying?
I think so, yeah. I think some of the best success we can have is when we're not just focused on the physical infrastructure, but the human experience of that infrastructure, regardless of what you're planning for. because there's a different mindset. So a sociologist or a social worker or someone working in the healthcare field is going to have a different understanding of how that space can benefit. And the more we can bridge the silos, so to speak, and start working well together, again, being connected. There's a common theme.
Yes. There's a line in this talk.
Yeah, but that connection beyond our silos is I think vital to creating a much more inclusive space.
Can you give us some good examples of cities or countries where exactly that has been done? Some good projects that might inspire us on that level?
Yeah, well, I mean, we talked about the Superblocks program, and I think that's...
we can talk more about it.
We can talk more about it.
We never talk enough about Superblocks of Barcelona.
But that's a combination of city planning, of healthcare coming together, of people working on architecture, all of these fields coming together to understand a better way of looking at the city. And Bogota as well. When I was there, I was meeting with mobility professionals. I was meeting with people working specifically on women's issues, people focused on healthcare, but they're all working towards the same thing. They're all working towards creating a more equitable space. And that's all through different approaches, but at the core of it, it's different people from different fields understanding that in order to achieve success, we have to work together. I think, unfortunately, in a lot of cities, it's still very transportation focuses on transportation, and we don't need healthcare involved in this side because that's a whole different, or sports and rec, for example, involved, but they're all connected. So what I hope is that, knowing this, seeing the successes that have happened in other cities can help people shift that thinking a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know if it's known enough. I think if you talk to people, it often comes to connection, to equity, to social interaction, and conversation easily goes there, but it's too often a side product, and to put it in the core, saying we're actually not doing mobility, we're doing equity, and in order to do so, hey, let's talk about public transport. I don't see many cities tackling their mobility policies in that way. It's still, oh, by the way, we did well on social issues, but it's not first goal.
Which is interesting, because if you're talking about, improving social safety or improving social equity for people that are lower income or struggling, how they move in the city is just as vital to making sure that they have health services available to them in their communities. How are they going to get there in the first place? And so if that conversation is not happening together, there's a disconnect that we need to be addressing.
Although in Brussels, one of the debates is that it's sometimes considered a luxury. It's like, okay, we need jobs, we need safety in our streets, and having public space and changing public space, it is not at the core of debates on, certainly on equity or poverty, or it's considered, I know it's not true, it's often considered as this is what comes afterwards. And if you go too fast, you even have local population often saying, well, but are you trying to get us away, and you're making a public space that's more attractive for other people? Is it against us? So it is difficult to make public space as an element in social politics in general, and I feel it's difficult to get that into the frame and put that on the table. Yeah,
well, and that's where a really sort of holistic approach is really important. One of the things that I think every city experiences this, but we certainly saw happen in Vancouver, is the investment in cycling infrastructure and in public space was in more affluent areas, generally speaking. And so we didn't stop, or we didn't change the congestion problem for the people that lived outside of the city center, because they still didn't have access to public transportation. Cycling was not safe enough for them or realistic for them, and so we still had the influx of cars. And then what happens is the places where they were investing, you see gentrification, and so these other neighborhoods are worried. But if you take a much more holistic approach, and it's not just we're going to focus on this affluent area first, and then we'll focus on this area, and then we'll focus on this one, but rather address all of them as a whole. And maybe it's not exactly, a full cycling plan or full public space plan all at once, but like little pieces as you go. It makes it more equitable in terms of distribution across the city. So it doesn't make one area more desirable all of a sudden while the other ones are waiting, but rather, you know, everyone's sort of coming along at the same time. But it's really hard for cities to do because then you have to have the budget to make that happen.
The budget, the planning needs to go all the way. And,
yeah.
And sometimes I think it's, okay, we can wait for the perfect city and create a perfect city, but on the other hand, let's take the positive energy there is to do some things. And sometimes, like I told about this summer project, it was actually not conceived as a social project and then suddenly turned out to be. And so trying to work in public space and creating public space on itself, just literally making space for people, already brings people together, creates connections, and then it will influence and it will strengthen people. And
there's two-pronged. It can be, I see this happening and now I want this in my community, or I see this happening there and I see what's happening there in terms of gentrification and I don't want that to happen here. And finding that balance, I think, is the challenge for people like yourself and people working in cities. Is, you know, how do we get that balance so we can keep moving forward without, you know, stalling our process as we go? Yeah. Okay.
If you would turn it around, if you could ask me a question, what would it be? If you would change the role, it's like, because you're advocating, I'm a policymaker, and I was advocating before as well, and perhaps you'll be a policymaker one day, so we change roles, but it's not like ask me a question, but what you expect from politicians? What would be the one thing you say, okay, you're a politician, please, this is my question for you, my desire that you do.
That's a big question. Yes, I think
that's why I keep it to the end.
I know. I would ask you how you plan to stay hopeful and still find strength in this space, because I think, you know, as we've pointed out in this conversation, you know, it can be draining, it can be challenging, it can be scary, and sometimes we just want to have a break. So how do you keep yourself moving forward? Like what keeps you inspired to keep, you know, bettering your own city?
I think talks like this, because you also said, Van, you admitted, like, sometimes I'm tired as well and I just want to live in a good place. I think we all have this feeling once. I'm not going to move to Delft. I love Brussels too much, but it's important, I think, that we connect, we talk about it. Again, this connection, it's giving energy. If you talk to other people and you notice that you have a lot in common, and most of the time people have more in common than they think, and then that gives this energy, and seeing these positive results and talking about these positive results. And I think that's one thing that you're doing, is showing this big bundle of positive energy, and it's helping, I think, people saying, okay, things are happening everywhere. Also this exchange, saying, okay, often we're in our city, but we know in other cities actually the same things are happening, the same debates are happening, and the same struggles, and then having contact, sharing, and supporting one another. I think that's crucial, and that's, again, connecting, which might be the key to this talk. So.
Well, I think that's it. It's the power of the network, whether it's a transportation network or even just the network of people in this space. Because we, like you said, we're all doing kind of the same thing. We can all learn from each other. Yeah. So, yeah.
I think that's a good conclusion. So thank you very much. And I've learned a lot from you. I'm really looking forward to the next book, but I always enjoyed the previous books. And I hope you keep on having the energy to go around and talk and convince people in what is possible if we make changes, and how we can reconnect if we change our public space. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and keep doing what you're doing, because it's amazing.
Thank you.